as I was making this, I immediately thought it would make more sense to have this as more of a Jekyll and Hyde cartoon than it would be what I have created here. But you know what? I'm going to stick with these guys because I'm super proud of my little carbon dioxide and my hydrogen molecules. I like the bucket, but he's not as cool as the other ones. So we have this great escape that's going to go on. And it's going to star our adventurer, which is going to be our carbon dioxide. I just did carbon dioxide. I didn't want to do water, although technically it's both of them. But I'm just going to focus on carbon dioxide because that's the one thing we can read in the pre-hospital environment. And then the other character that we really are concerned with is hydrogen. And I have him as a flaming ball of fury because that's how I think about hydrogen. So when it comes to circulation, the thing that we're really concerned with is our main characters of carbon dioxide and water. So our story is always going to begin with carbon dioxide and water. These are metabolic byproducts. So they're essentially the exhaust of the mitochondrial processes. Their ultimate goal is simple: escaping. They want to leave the body through the lungs. I could have probably made carbon dioxide into like a whimsical fairy or a hippie or something who's just free-spirited, but I like them as an angry carbon dioxide molecule. And they want to leave the body through the lungs. Usually they drift through the bloodstream quietly, but when the body is working too hard and ventilates too slowly, these little adventurers start to accumulate. So you end up with a lot more of them. But instead of being more, I'm just going to make them a lot bigger. So just imagine that there's more carbon dioxide for whatever reason. As the adventurer, grows, as we get more and more of them, that trips the body's security system. And you have chemoreceptors in the medulla and the carotid and aortic bodies, and they sense this rising level of CO2. Baroreceptors also monitor the pressure changes, and they notice that there's a bigger change of carbon dioxide. So now carbon dioxide's huge, and something needs to happen. We can't keep carbon dioxide in our system. It will actually start causing a lot of problems. So once the body realizes it can't transport these little adventurers, it needs to change them. And that's where they enter the chamber, or I put a little bucket, a little transformation bucket in the red blood cell with the help of this enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. I always say anhydrogenase, but it's not anhydrase. And it fuses CO2 and H2O together to form carbonic acid. Now, this is where the birth of a villain comes into play, and it all starts with CO2 and H2O becoming carbonic acid. If carbonic acid is unstable, immediately it's going to split apart. And that's where the story takes the dark turn. The split creates two very different ions. One of them is going to be bicarb, and the other is going to be hydrogen. Bicarbonate is the hero of the buffer. It's the base that tries to keep the peace. But then you have the hydrogen ion, which is he's the bully. He's a butthole. And the hydrogen ion is pure acid. It's the villain of our story because the more of it exists, the more it destroys the body's delicate pH balance, which, by the way, the body's delicate pH balance is a very narrow window between 7.35 to 7.45. And that's something that you just kind of have to memorize and just remember, okay, that's it. Do we test that in the field? No. The only surrogate we kind of have is end-tidal CO2 readings, which we can get off of end-tidal CO2 nasal cannulas as long as they're breathing, if they're using their nose to breathe, or if we have it attached, and we should, when we're ventilate somebody with a supraglottic airway device or endotracheal tube. And the readings we're generally wanting is between 35 and 45. So it's kind of nice because it lines up with the 7.35 to 7.45. I think that's just more incidental. So back to the hydrogen. If the hydrogen ion, if that villain runs rampant, then the body becomes way too acidic. So it's kind of weird the way pH works. The more hydrogen there is, the less the pH is. And there's a reason for it. It's a logarithm calculation, and you can do the formula. There's YouTube videos and stuff out there. I'm not going to go over it because that's a little bit of a deeper dive into hydrogen concentrations. But basically, the more hydrogen there is, the lower the pH value. The lower the hydrogen concentration is, the higher the pH value and more alkalytic it is. So let's see how this sequence plays out in the real world. We're going to find them in the back of the ambulance because that's really all I care about. One of them could be the clogged exit. So I didn't write this down, at least I didn't draw it out, and I should have, because my kidneys look really awesome over on the right, and that's the renal system. So the right-hand side of the formula is the renal system. The left-hand side of the formula is the respiratory system, or the lungs. Next time I won't be so lazy and I'll actually draw the lungs out. So, like, imagine an opiate overdose. So the patient stops breathing or has a low tidal volume. That's like a big key word. If you ever see low tidal volume, you know you're supposed to ventilate the patient. The adventurers, the CO2, they can't escape. So they start piling up on the left side. When they start piling up on the left side, so I'm just going to use green here, what's going to end up happening? Remember, these are byproducts of cellular metabolism. They can't go anywhere, so that's where carbonic acid comes into play. So every part of this system, every part of these steps are going to start swapping over to the right, because if you see these little arrows here, let me highlight them, that just means this is a reversible reaction, which is pretty awesome. So that means CO2 and H2O can easily combine into carbonic acid and make their way to bicarbonate and release a hydrogen ion. So CO2 piles up on the left side, forcing the transformation into carbonic acid. This creates a massive army of hydrogen ions, and that's what causes the blood pH to drop, because as this goes down, you end up with more carbonic acid. What happens to happen to the carbonic acid? It ends up increasing our hydrogen ions, and that ends up increasing our acidosis. But what's causing the acidosis? Well, the respiratory system is. So because the respiratory system is, we call it respiratory acidosis. So if we end up with respiratory acidosis, one of the ways that the body is going to compensate for that is through metabolic alkalosis. So the exact opposite. And that ends up becoming more of an issue when we start dealing with that reaction that goes too far heavy on the right side. It has to go back to the left side, because HCO3 bicarb, I put soap here because it makes sense that bicarb is binding to something, kind of the way soap binds to grime and dirt and grease and stuff like that. So that's why I think of bicarbonate. It's not necessarily a soap, although I'm sure you can use it as a soap. But either way, let's talk about the other scenario, forced eviction. So with this situation, we end up with a patient who is in a respiratory alkalotic condition. Now, a respiratory alkalotic condition is the exact opposite, where they're breathing way too much. So if the patient starts breathing way too much for whatever reason, maybe they're having an anxiety reaction, they're hyperventilating. A lot of times it's just going to be panic induced. So you end up kicking out way too many adventurers. So there it starts to go down. The left side of the equation becomes the vacuum. So in order to fill it, the hydrogen villains are actually sucked back into the transformation to become carbonic acid and eventually CO2. So actually you end up with this reaction of all of this bicarbonate and hydrogen in your body that you have will actually become carbonic acid, and then that can dissociate and it can help replace that CO2 and H2O. Because what you end up with is a metabolic alkalosis and I meant to say respiratory acid alkalosis, not respiratory. A respiratory alkalosis. And the way that the body will try to deal with it is through a metabolic acidosis. So the blood becomes too alkaline. There aren't enough enemies to keep the balance. So the metabolic stage is a little different too. The metabolic stage is when you have too much hydrogen for whatever reason. So let's think about diabetic ketoacidosis or sepsis. This isn't a breathing problem, it's a metabolic one. The body is flooded with ketones, which are a form of acid, and there's actually 3 different types of acids, but that's for a different lecture at some time, and they end up dissociating and creating more hydrogen ions. And that creates a secondary army of hydrogen villains on the right side. So because of that, the formula has to shift to the left. So the hero becomes bicarbonate, because bicarbonate can rush in to neutralize any extra acid, turning them back into carbonic acid, and that forces the equation to the left, creating more CO2. So you end up with an underlying metabolic acidotic condition. But here's the thing. You have to know that's happening because this patient's going to be in respiratory alkalosis as the compensatory mechanism. I'll just put here compensatory mech. So that means your patient is going to have increased respiratory rate, increased respiratory depth. That looks an awful lot like Kussmaul's respirations. And usually you're going to see that with, you'll have high glucose. You see that with DKA. We could see this with sepsis. There's some other conditions, but those are the main ones we'll find. You don't want to try to control and slow that respiratory rate down because it's the only thing that's keeping the body in check and able to get rid of that excess hydrogen, because the hydrogen really is hiding. It's being bound to that bicarb. Once it's bound to the bicarb, it becomes a carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can easily be dissociated, and we can breathe it out through CO2 and H2O. This is why your DKA patients have Kussmaul's respirations. They're desperately trying to get rid of all of those extra CO2 adventurers, escape to get rid of the acid. So in the system, the balance of the body is a constant tug of war between the adventurers on the left, the villain on the right, and then you kind of have bicarbonate acting as the mediator to keep the peace. So let's think about this. I have a couple little diagrams. I kind of like them. They're little mind maps. I don't really understand the seesaw thing. I like tug of war a little better. I don't even know if I explained that well enough. I'll probably come back and do it again because these videos take a little bit too long. But let's see about respiratory acidosis. Let's see if we understand this well enough. What are some causes of respiratory acidosis? Well, it'll really be anything that's going to cause you to have decreased respiratory effort, decreased respiratory rate, so low tidal volume. So we can think narcotic overdose, COPD, chest wall trauma, or any sort of like neuromuscular disease that would prevent you from being able to get that adequate chest rise and fall. So let's do one thing. We need to know CO2, HCO3, and pH. What do you think the pH is going to be? Well, it says it in the name, acidosis, so the pH should be low. What about the CO2? If they're in acidosis, what do you think the CO2 is going to be? It should be high. What about HCO3, bicarb? Is that going to be high or is it going to be low? And can you tell me why, or I guess tell yourself because you're watching a video or listening to this, why that is? It should be high. Well, why would it be high? Well, we can go right back up to there. If we're in respiratory acidosis, CO2 is accumulating. It has to come, it combines with water, becomes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarb and hydrogen. So, of course, it's going to jack up the bicarb. In fact, long-standing COPD patients may have baseline bicarbonate that's elevated because their body's just kind of gotten used to it. All right, so let's do another one. Let's do respiratory alkalosis. This would be the exact opposite problem. We already went over one of them, which would be kind of like a panic attack. So anxiety, panic attacks, and then a pulmonary embolism. So what would the pH be? Low or high? Should be high. What would the CO2 be? Should be low because they're breathing it all off. What happens to the bicarb? Should be low. So because here's what's happening on that end. It's kind of this, it's a similar situation. The CO2 has dropped. And so we know that there's some bicarbonate and hydrogen that's floating around the body that can easily be converted to carbonic acid. So all of a sudden, all of this reaction jumps from the right and then goes to the left. So you're going to end up with a drop in bicarbonate and a drop in hydrogen. All right, let's do the last two. Metabolic acidosis. That's the one we're probably going to see the most in the field, and you probably already know a few examples, but DKA is a big one, sepsis, and severe diarrhea, base loss. And that's patients who have been having tremendous amount of diarrhea over a longer period of time. The pH is in the name, metabolic acidosis, so the pH is going to be low. What do you think the CO2 is going to be? Is it going to be high or low? Well, it should be low because of the metabolic acidosis. That's the problem. We have way too much hydrogen in the body. So the body's system wants to go from over here, the right side, and it's got to make its way back to the left side. So it'll end up becoming carbonic acid. So it goes this Mr. Little bucket over here, and then it'll go right back to CO2 and H2O where they create little adventurers, and those adventurers get to leave. So it makes sense, though. It makes sense then that, of course, our pH is going to be low and our CO2 is going to be low. What about our HCO3, our bicarb? What do you think that's going to be? Should be low as well. It's going to deplete our HCO3 over time because we have our HCO3, our bicarbonate, that's existing in our body, and as there's more hydrogen accumulating, it's going to start dropping and dropping and dropping and lowering that bicarb. So you're going to end up with a metabolic acidosis, and the body's going to compensate with a respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. Last thing, metabolic alkalosis. Pretty much the exact opposite. Think of everything that could cause metabolic alkalosis. Prolonged vomiting, so you're losing acids at this point. Nasogastric suctioning, diuretic use, and excess antacids. So think of someone who's like taking a whole lot of Tums, a whole lot of antacids. Maalox, any of those over-the-counter antacid medicines. That's why it's important to get a good medical history and medications that they've been taking, like how many Tums have you taken. If they've taken like 10 to 12, that's a pretty good idea that they might be in some type of metabolic alkalosis. So the pH value is already in the name, alkalosis, so it should be high. Our CO2, where should it be? It's actually going to be high as well. And our bicarb, high or low? It should be high as well. So the reason why our CO2 is high, so we end up with too much, our pH too high, we end up with way too much bicarb in our system relative to how much hydrogen, because there's a drop in hydrogen for whatever reason. So we end up having to swap over. We have way too much CO3. So when that happens, our bicarb, we're like, okay, there's too much on either end, whether it's the renal system or the respiratory system, it just goes the opposite direction. So if there's too much bicarb, it's going to become carbonic acid, and then it's going to go and dissociate into CO2 and H2O. That's going to end up increasing our CO2 levels. So I know this can be a little confusing, and there's a lot of videos online about this. I've always thought if you can figure out one side of the equation, like if you just know some of the reasons why you're even responding to begin with, if you have a DKA patient, a septic patient, then the respiratory findings should match the underlying metabolic conditions. Because in the field, we just don't understand the metabolic conditions well enough. We don't have the tests, we don't have the labs, we don't have the resources to. But we base everything off of the respiratory findings, the history, and the physical exam finding from the patient. Now, there's two different models to look at whenever you're trying to review acid-base balance. And I think this works pretty well, like respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. I think this will help you with like rote memorization. So it's on the Bloom's taxonomy level, it would be like the very bottom. If you just memorize this, you'll probably be okay. You'll figure it out on the test. But it won't literally help you whenever you have to critically navigate and integrate that information. So this is ultimately where you want to be. You want to be able to where you can actually synthesize this information, where you can critically analyze it, where you can look at a patient and say, oh, that's why they're breathing 32 times a minute, and we don't need to ventilate and slow them down, because if we do, we're going to knock out their compensatory mechanism and make the patient significantly worse. But in a pinch, you can memorize this. This is respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. And all that means is if the pH is high, the CO2, that's the respiratory component, is going to be low. If the pH is low, then the respiratory is going to be high. That's what respiratory opposite means. Metabolic equal, same thing. If the pH is high, the bicarb is going to be high. And if the pH is high, that's alkalotic. If the pH is low, then the bicarb is going to be low as well. That's acidosis. So that makes it a little bit easier to just, if you can just look at some lab values, you can see that and go, oh, okay, I know that if the pH is high and the CO2 is low, it's probably a respiratory alkalotic patient. But then they use metabolic acidosis to compensate for that respiratory alkalosis. I also like this model over here. I found this. I can't remember where I found it. I found it online. I think I just Googled it. But it shows the basic and acidic pH levels on the left-hand side. And then on the x-axis, you see the CO2, if it's low or if it's high. And man, it's really cool because CO2 levels will be high for metabolic alkalosis and respiratory acidosis, and low if it's in acidosis, metabolic, and respiratory alkalosis. So it makes a lot more sense. Anyways, I know this is a lot of information. I'll try to make this a little bit more thorough at a separate recording.